"You're the man I saw in my dreams," she whispered, blood on her lips, voice shaking with something between faith and terror. "By the law of the spirits. He wasn't hell, Wyatt Flint." The stink of blood and wood smoke clung to the cramped air like bad memories. It was quiet now, save for the slow, ragged breaths of the woman on the bed, and the scrape of Wyatt Flint's chair as he dragged it closer to the door. Revolver on his hip. Every nerve she lay there, wrapped in one of his threadbare blankets, shivering, not from the cold, but from pain, from shock, from whatever demons chased her before she collapsed in his arms He hadn't been a ghost on this land for years. 39. Ex-cavalry. A man who'd followed orders too, long and buried too many good men to pretend the world still made sense. The war had eaten the soft parts of him. What was left was, but that all changed when hours earlier. The discovery. The sun had bled out behind Silver Mesa, leaving the land soaked in burnt orange light. Just emptiness and wind. That's how he liked it, until 50 yards ahead, half buried in dust. At first he figured it was tarp blown from a wagon, but it moved, slow, weak. Not like something Wyatt's hand went to his revolver. He scanned the ridge, the wash, the shadows. No glint of steel, no whisper of movement. But the silence was too still to trust. Then he saw an Apache woman, young and barefoot, crawling, her deerskin dress torn open at the shoulder, blood running down her arm and soaking into the earth. Her dark hair clung to her sweat-slicked face. She looked like a spirit half-dragged. He circled slow. Didn't speak at first. The desert played tricks, used the wounded as bait. He'd seen it before. But this wasn't that. Her eyes met his. "Full of fire even beneath the F-men," she whispered. "They tried to take me, I ran." Her voice cracked like old timber. She clutched the gash on her side and tried to sit up, only to fold like paper. Wyatt caught her before she hit the ground. Her weight was nothing, her skin hot as a forge. Her dress slipped. She grabbed at it, shame flaring in her face, trying to hide herself from him. He didn't stare, didn't smirk, just spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you." Just 7 words. But something in the way he said them made her nod. He lifted her into the saddle, careful not to touch skin, felt her tremble in his arms. Smelled the blood, the smoke, the terror. "Name?" he asked. "Ayana." "Wyatt." She studied him, scar on his jaw, the way he sat the horse like a man who forgot how to sleep indoors. She knew what kind of man he was before he said another word. The cabin wasn't far, just a crooked square of logs and grit. He laid her on his cot, cleaned the wound with hands trained by war. She bit down on the pain. Didn't cry, not once. That told him everything. When the stitches were done, he wrapped her side with steady hands. She pulled the blanket tight around her chest, watching him like a cornered fox. "You're safe here tonight," he said. She looked at him, really looked, and said, "You're the man I saw in my dreams. The spirit showed me your face. According to the sacred law, you are now my husband." The choice. He didn't flinch, didn't laugh either. Marriage? He hadn't thought about that word since Eliza left him behind in another life, back when he believed in things like homes and Sunday mornings. Ayana reached for his hand, not to claim but to offer trust, and he took it. He sat in the chair beside her bed, revolver ready. He watched the door, listening to the wind. She fell, asleep, holding onto his wrist like it was the last piece of the world, not trying to hurt her. Wyatt Flint stayed awake for both of them. If that hit you in the gut the way it hit us, don't leave just yet. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when the riders come back. Because they will come back. And when they do, she won't be alone. The night stretched long, even after the sky had gone black and silent. No more screams, no more hooves, just the creak of wood as it settled and the faint hiss of dying embers. Wyatt Flint didn't blink much, just sat there like a sentinel made of dust and regret, revolver loose on his thigh, hand resting near hers. He hadn't meant to get involved. Lord knows he'd walked away from worse, but something in the way she clung to life with her teeth, how she pressed that blanket to her chest like it was the last wall between her and hell, something in that cracked him open, and now, here he was, guarding a stranger like she was kin. Ayanna, stirred just past dawn, a little whimper escaping as she tried to shift. Sweat still beaded along her brow. When her eyes found him, she stiffened, then blinked in disbelief. "You stayed?" she said hoarsely. "I said I would," he answered, handing her the tin cup. She drank slow, wincing, eyes on him the whole time. The shack Wyatt's cabin wasn't much more than 4 walls and a roof, built with the kind of hands that didn't expect comfort, just function. Tools lined the far wall. A butchered rabbit hung near the stove. A cracked mirror above a wash basin caught the light just enough to remind a man of his face when he didn't want to see it. She noticed the scars on his knuckles when he adjusted the pillow behind her back. "You're a soldier," she said, not asking. "Was," he replied, jaw tightening. "You leave because of what you saw?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. Then, "Because of what I did." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. The stitch. He rolled up his sleeves and checked her bandage, peeling it slow. The skin around the wound was inflamed but not poisoned yet. She sucked in air as he dabbed at the edge with cool water, the pain sharp as a branding iron. She gripped the mattress again, just like she had the night before. He could feel her watching him. Not the way a woman watches a man. The way someone watches a rattlesnake, waiting to see if it'll strike. When the blanket slipped again, he reached out not to stare but to shield. His hands were careful, impersonal, quick. "You're safe," he said, recovering her chest. "No one touches you here, not even me. Not unless you say so." Ayanna didn't speak, but something changed in her posture, like her body finally believed what her ears were hearing. Respect. That's what she'd been stripped of, that's what he gave back. The vow she lay back, breathing heavier now, face pale under the sweat. But her eyes were steady. "You asked what they wanted with me," she said. He nodded. "They call me troublemaker," she whispered. "Said I helped an elder escape. They said my price went up because I fight back." Wyatt's jaw clenched. This wasn't some wandering gang, this was organized filth. Traders who trafficked in fear. And Ayanna? She wasn't just another victim. They saw her as a threat to their business. He stood, paced once, and pushed the provisions chest tight against the window. Then the table. The soldier in him was waking up. Fortifying, planning. She watched all of it, never saying a word. "You got people?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Only one, a grave on a hill. Finn didn't make it home." She nodded. She understood the weight of dead names. "I had a sister," she said. "Lita. 4 winters back. They took her, never saw her again." The pain in her voice wasn't loud. It was worn thin from being carried too long. Wyatt sat back down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "They're gonna come again," he said, voice low. "I know. We'll be ready." The quiet between Ayanna struggled to sit up again. He helped her without thinking, hand to her elbow. She faltered, winced, and the blanket dropped again. She froze, eyes wide, panic flaring in her chest like fire to dry brush. But Wyatt's eyes never left her face, not once. He readjusted the blanket gently, respectfully, like a man folding a flag. "No one's gonna take you," he said. "Not while I'm still breathing." That hit her harder than anything else. Not just because he said it, but because he meant it. She touched his wrist again, same as the night before. A small gesture, grounding, real. "Why do you help a stranger?" she asked. He looked away toward the door. "Because someone once helped me, and I never repaid that debt." The fire had burned down to its bones, just red coals now, breathing quiet heat into the cold of morning. Wyatt Flint hadn't slept a damn minute. He hadn't even tried. He sat in that worn-out chair by the door, boots planted wide, hand resting near his revolver, eyes trained on nothing and everything all at once. Ayanna was asleep, or close to it. Her breathing had evened out, shallow but steady. The blanket, still clutched tight to her chest, one hand tucked beneath it like she didn't trust the warmth unless she was holding it there herself. Wyatt didn't move. He'd seen this kind of stillness before, after a battle, after the screaming stopped. It wasn't peace. It was shock wrapped in silence. And the silence could kill you if you let it get too loud. The weight of the law, she stirred as dawn bled through the cracks in the cabin wall. Her, lips parted, dry and cracked. "You didn't sleep." "I didn't need to," he said. "That's not true." Wyatt shrugged. She sat up slowly, winced. "You're still watching the door." "I always do," he muttered, gaze hard. Just never had someone behind it worth protecting before. Ayanna stared at him a long while, then looked away. She remembered her words from the night before. "You are the man I saw in my dreams. You are now my husband." Maybe she meant it as tradition, or maybe she meant it as salvation. Either way, it had burrowed deep into Wyatt's chest like a bullet made of hope. He hated that he didn't hate it. The ghost of Eliza, her voice cut through the quiet again. "You ever been married?" Wyatt's eyes flicked to the fire. "Almost." "Her name?" "Eliza." That name tasted like whiskey and regret. "We had a plan. Before the war." "What happened?" "I came back different. She didn't. I pushed her away before I wrecked her." Ayanna nodded slowly. No judgment in her eyes, just understanding. "You think you're too broken for something good." He didn't answer, but his silence was louder than any confession. "You're not," she whispered. The internal vow Ayanna reached for him again, her fingers brushing his wrist, gentle, almost shy. Not like she was claiming anything, like she was checking if he was real. Wyatt didn't pull away. "I'm not asking you to carry me," she said. "I know, but I need to know you won't leave." Wyatt stared at her hand. Her nails were short, cracked, the knuckles bruised. This was a woman who'd fought every inch of her life to stay standing. He made a vow then, not the kind spoken in front of preachers, but the kind etched in bone. No one would ever take her again. The vigil. He stood and dragged the chair closer, to the door, set his rifle across his lap. Ayanna shifted under the blanket, watching him through half-lidded eyes. "You really gonna sit there all night?" she asked. "Every damn one of them if I have to." That made her smile for the first time, not wide. Just a small curl of her lips like something warm broke loose in her chest. "Most men run when they see trouble." "I'm not most men." "No, you're not." Wyatt rolled his shoulders, then looked back at her. "If they come back, I want you behind the bed. Stay low. Let me handle it. And if you fall, you pick up the gun and finish what I started." Ayanna's eyes didn't flinch. "I will. The first promise." Kept night came again before either of them said another word. The wind howled like a starving wolf across the mesa, rattling the window shutter and carrying the scent of dry grass and smoke. Ayanna dozed off around sunset. Her hand still curled the edge of the blanket like a tether. Every so often she stirred, startled by dreams, but the moment her eyes opened and caught sight of Wyatt, still there, unmoved, watchful, she'd drift off again. He wasn't just guarding her body. He was guarding her peace. It had been years since he kept a promise that mattered. But this one stuck. He wasn't sure what the word husband meant to her people, but sitting there in the dark, protecting her while she slept, it felt like it meant something. The first rays of morning stretched long over the ridge, gold and cruel. The wind carried with it the scent of ash and dry dirt, whispering promises Wyatt Flint didn't care to hear. He stood by the window, one eye on the land and the other on the woman still sleeping in his bed. Her breathing was easier now, no longer tight with pain, but he knew better than to take it as peace. The world didn't hand out peace. You had to build it yourself. nail by nail, gun by gun, and sometimes brick by bloody brick. The hard dawn Wyatt opened the cabin door slow, rifle slung low but ready. The dirt outside was dry and loose, too dry. It held every footprint like a confession. His eyes tracked the path he rode in on. There it was, her blood trail. Faint now but visible in patches of disturbed dust and trampled grass. He knelt down, pressing 2 fingers to a deeper impression near the creek bend. Boot heel. Not his. They'd come again. Of that he was certain. He turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching over dry gravel, and shut the door behind him like a man sealing a vault. She's still sleeping, he muttered to himself, before pulling the heavy wooden provisions chest toward the window. Good. Building. Walls. The room echoed with the scrape of furniture against floorboards. Wyatt wasn't graceful about it. He didn't need to be. He needed barriers. He needed sightlines. He needed time. He hauled a pine dresser in front of the door next, wedging a crossbeam behind it. It wouldn't stop bullets, but it might slow. When Ayanna stirred, the noise didn't startle her. She just blinked slowly and asked, "They're coming, aren't they?" "They will," he said, still moving, still bracing. "Tracks in the dirt'll point 'em here easy." Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter. Not in fear exactly, but in knowing. "They don't quit," she said. "Not once they've tasted control." "No," Wyatt said. "They don't." Lowering walls, she shifted, trying to sit up on her own this time. Her side pulled tight, breath catching as she winced. Wyatt didn't offer to help, not because he didn't want to, but because he could tell she needed the win. Once upright, she looked at the barricades, then at him. "Should have told you sooner," she said. "Why they want me." He turned toward her but didn't speak. "My sister," Ayanna said. "Lita. 4 winters back. They came to our village, said they wanted trade. They took her instead, never saw her again." Wyatt's jaw worked tight like he was biting down on something that didn't want to be swallowed. "You think she's alive?" he asked. Ayanna didn't blink. "No." The silence that followed was colder than the wind outside. She went on, softer now. "I started helping other women escape, taught them to run when the trucks came, hide their children. They called me a troublemaker, marked me." Her eyes lifted to him. "That's why they'll come. Not because of what I am. Because of what I did." Wyatt walked to the fireplace, adding another log. The flames rose in protest. "They saw you fight back," he said. "And they want to make you disappear." Ayanna nodded. The grave called Finn. He stood staring into the fire a while until the heat warmed the cold place just beneath his ribs. "You said your sister's name was Leda." "Yes. My closest friend died in a war I shouldn't have been in," Wyatt said. "Finn. Buried him on a hill 6 miles west. No one ever visits but me." He turned toward her. "I'm not afraid of dying. Haven't been in years. But I sure as hell ain't gonna let your name end up carved next to his." Ayanna's gaze didn't waver. "Then I'm not afraid either." Shared scars. She tried to stand, too fast. Her leg buckled under her weight. Wyatt was there before she hit the ground, again. His arm slid beneath hers, strong but respectful. The blanket slipped down her back, exposing the scarred curve of her shoulder. She froze, not because of pain, because of memory, but Wyatt. He looked away, looked up. Never let his eyes drop. "Let me help," he said, voice steady. "No one is touching me here without my say," she said softly. Wyatt met her eyes. "Not even me," he said. She let him lift her gently back onto the bed. The final nail as she caught her breath, she looked up at the cabin walls. At the shadows stretching long. At the man still standing between her and the dark. "You could have let me die in the dirt." Wyatt didn't respond. "You didn't," she whispered. "I'm not the kind of man that walks away anymore," he said. And then he picked up his rifle and checked the sight. As the wind rattled the walls like a warning, the blood trail would bring them here. And this time, they weren't just strangers waiting to die. They were two people who had finally chosen to live. The afternoon light cut across the cabin floor in long, slanted bars, dust drifting like spirits too tired to haunt. Outside, the land was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have tucked itself behind the rocks, waiting. Inside, Wyatt Flint stood by the door, rifle across his chest, listening for hoofbeats that hadn't come yet. Ayanna was trying to move. Again. She hated asking for help. He could see it in the way she clenched her jaw when she shifted, in how she gripped the edge of the table like it owed her something. Wyatt didn't step in, not right away. He knew pride when he saw it, and he respected the hell out of it, but pride could be a cruel thing when pain took the legs out from under you. The stumble. She stood slow, her feet bare against the wood floor, a blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The cabin's warmth had faded, the fire now just a soft glow in the corner. Her hands trembled, but she pushed forward with all the quiet defiance of someone who refused to be weak a second longer. Then, her leg buckled. Wyatt caught her before she hit the ground, one arm wrapping around her back, the other steadying her elbow. She gasped, sharp and panicked, not from the fall, but from what came next. The blanket slipped. Her shoulder and the top of her chest were bare again, vulnerable, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. Her breath caught like she'd been slapped. Her eyes went wide, hollowed by instinct, history, memory. Wyatt looked up. Not down, not sideways, up, straight into her eyes, like a man answering to something higher than himself. And without a word, he lifted the blanket back over her, gentle as a man folding a flag. No shame, no hurry, just the kind of quiet that meant he saw her, not what they'd tried to reduce her to. The promise. No one's touching you here, he said, voice like gravel soaked in truth. Not without your say, not even me. Her body shook, not from fear this time, but from the weight of those words. They hit deeper than any bullet, carved deeper than any blade. Respect. That's what he gave her. More than protection, more than safety. Choice. She stood there, holding on to him, the blanket now drawn tight around her chest like armor. The fire didn't crackle. The wind didn't howl. The world for a second went still, and in that stillness something inside her loosened. Not her grip, her fear. The unspoken things back on the bed. She sat quiet, still breathing hard. Wyatt poured water into a tin cup and passed it to her. Their hands touched for half a second. That was all. Ayanna studied him now, not like a stranger anymore, but like someone trying to measure a thing they'd never thought they'd see again. "What kind of man are you?" she asked softly. Wyatt didn't answer. Didn't need to. He just picked up his rifle and sat by the door again, same as he had the last 2 nights. His presence said more than words ever could. The cracks in the wall later, she spoke again, voice stronger. "You asked what they wanted with me. They saw me help an elder woman escape, Elu. They called me a bad seed, said I'd stir up other girls. They want to break me so the others fall back in line." Wyatt didn't flinch, just nodded. He'd seen that kind of control in uniform, in war. When men used fear like a whip. "They won't get the chance," he said. "I don't want to live hiding. Then we won't." The quiet alliance. She reached for the pistol on the nightstand, hands still a little shaky. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "You plan on shooting before I do?" he asked. "If it comes to it." He nodded once, solemn. "Then I reckon we make a damn good team." For a long time they didn't speak, just sat there, each listening to the creak of the cabin walls and the beat of their own guarded hearts. She broke the silence with a whisper. "Thank you." He didn't ask for what. He just answered the way he always did, with action, not noise. The moon rose behind a curtain of high clouds, throwing a silver haze across the dry land. It wasn't full, but it was sharp enough to slice shadows through. The mesquite. Wyatt Flint stood by the window, rifle balanced in his hands, boots silent on the cabin floor. His breath was slow but not calm. It had been too quiet for too long. And in the west, quiet wasn't comfort. It was warning. Behind him, Ayanna lay awake, her eyes fixed on the rafters above. She hadn't asked if the men would come. She already knew. The sound it came like a whisper sharpened on steel, a distant horse whinny just loud enough to be heard. Not wild, not startled. Signal. Wyatt's head turned like a hinge. "They're here," he said. Ayanna sat up fast, clutching the pistol. He'd shown her how to load. She didn't ask questions. She didn't panic. She moved like someone who'd already accepted that this night might be her last, but she damn sure wouldn't let it be taken from her. Wyatt blew out the lantern in one smooth breath. The room plunged into darkness save for the low ember glow of the fire's last breath. The shadows. "Behind the bed," he whispered. Ayanna nodded, dragging herself into position. Her side still ached, but her fear burned hotter than pain now. Wyatt crouched near the door, rifle aimed, heart pounding like hooves on hardpack. He saw the shadows detach from the ridgeline, 2 riders, maybe 3. Moving slow. Confident. That was good. Confident men made sloppy mistakes. He narrowed his eyes, reading the land like scripture. One man peeled off toward the right flank, another closer, too close to the front window. Wyatt didn't move, didn't blink. The terror Ayanna heard a voice outside. Familiar, ugly. It curled inside her chest like smoke from a burned-out prayer. "That's him," she mouthed. "The one who grabbed me." Wyatt gave the smallest nod. Then he saw it. A rifle barrel tapping the wooden frame of the window, the fool outside thinking he could peek in, thinking he'd find an easy kill. Wyatt exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The shot. The gunshot cracked through, the silence like lightning splitting a dead tree. Glass exploded outward. A body dropped with a wet thud. No cry. Just wait. Ayanna flinched, but didn't scream. Her hands gripped the pistol tighter, chest heaving with adrenaline. Outside, someone cursed. "Down!" Wyatt barked. A second shot tore through the log wall. Splinters rained down near Ayanna's head. She ducked low, her body screaming from the sudden twist, but she stayed behind the bed, heart pounding, breath shallow, alive. The name then came, the whisper, low but loud enough to pierce the chaos. Silas Thorne wants her alive. The name hit Wyatt's brain like a hammer. He'd heard that name back in town. A rancher with gold and rot in his blood. Paid men to do the work his hands were too clean for. The kind of man who bought everything he touched, including people. Wyatt's jaw clenched. He chambered another round. That name changed things. It wasn't just about Ayanna anymore. This was a message, a claim. And Wyatt Flint didn't believe in ownership. Not of land, not of women, not of lives. The flight one of the attackers tried to run, spooked by the gunfire. Hoofbeats scrambled across the gravel. The other yelled something about retreat, but it was jumbled in panic. Wyatt fired again, another scream. Not fatal, but it'd leave a mark. Then the sounds faded. Just wind and hooves disappearing into the dark, gone, for now. The aftermath, silence, returned, but it was no longer the quiet of peace. It was the kind that follows death. Wyatt rose slowly, rifle still in hand. He moved to the shattered window and peered through, sweeping the ridge one last time. Nothing. Then he turned to Ayanna, who was still crouched, her hands white-knuckled around the pistol. "It's over," he said. She nodded once. "For now." The anchor Wyatt walked over, offering a hand. She didn't hesitate. As he helped her to her feet, she swayed but didn't fall. "You did good," he said. "I was terrified. That's what being brave means." She looked up at him. "They'll be back, with more." "I know." Ayanna glanced at the blood near the window. "You could have let them take me. Would have saved yourself the trouble." Wyatt shook his head. "Trouble ain't what keeps me up at night. Regret does." She studied him for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, Thank you. He nodded, voice low. We ain't done yet. The body lay where it had fallen, half in the moonlight, half in the sagebrush. Wyatt hadn't moved it, not yet. There was something sacred about death, even when it wore the face of a bastard. The blood had soaked into the earth by morning. Red turned rust. Soil accepted it like it had done 100 times before. Ayanna stood by the door, arms crossed tight over her chest. She hadn't spoken since sunrise. Wyatt stepped out, boot crunching gravel as he crossed the yard. He didn't bother saddling Dusty. This ride would be short. He was headed for the body. The mark, the dead man had a badge on his belt. Not law, but something close. A crooked silver brand with the letters TST burned into it. Thorn. Silas Thorn. Wyatt's jaw set hard as stone. He'd seen that mark before back in Yuma. Ranch hands with too much money and not enough honor. Men who believed land, women, and justice were all things you could buy if your pockets were deep enough. He crouched down, lifted the dead man's collar. Tattoos ran up the man's neck, symbols he didn't recognize. But Ayanna did. That's prison ink, she said from behind him, from out east. You sure? Positive. He wasn't just a ranch thug. He was brought in. Wyatt stood slow. The sun hit his face and the heat made the sweat on his back feel like ice. This ain't local trouble, he muttered. Silas is importing men. Ayanna nodded. That means he's desperate. Or scared. The saddle Wyatt hauled the body onto the man's own horse, strapping it awkwardly over the saddle. Blood dripped slow and dark, painting a trail like a curse. What are you doing? Ayanna asked. Sending a message. To who? Wyatt tied off the reins and slapped the horse's flank. To Silas. The horse bolted toward the east trail, carrying its cargo like a warning nailed to a door. The wind changes back inside. Wyatt paced. He was a man used to quiet, but now the silence gnawed at him. Ayanna broke it. Why'd you save me? She asked. Wyatt paused, looked her dead in the eye. You didn't need saving, he said. You needed someone to stand beside you, her lip trembled, but only for a second, then she nodded, sat down, loaded the pistol again with the grace of someone who no longer feared death, only dishonor. The whisper. From town later that evening, as the sun bled out across the hills, a knock came at the cabin door, not fists, not boots. A knock. Wyatt raised the rifle. Ayanna stood ready. The door creaked open slow. It was a kid, barely 16, maybe younger, pale, sweaty, terrified. He held up a crumpled envelope and a small pouch. Said to bring this. The boy muttered, Don't shoot me, I didn't read nothing, I swear. Wyatt took the envelope. Inside was a single line in thick, uneven handwriting. You're protecting something that don't belong to you, Flint. Bring her to the Red Barn by sundown tomorrow, or you both die slow. St. The pouch held something heavier than it should have. Teeth. 3 of them. Human. The line in the sand. Ayanna stared at the note, lips tight. I'm not going, she said. Wyatt didn't argue. He folded the paper, pocketed it, and looked her square in the eyes. Then we make our stand. She smiled. Small, broken, brave. I was hoping you'd say that. The forge that night, Wyatt worked. He cleaned every rifle, laid out every round like scripture, sharpened his knife until the edge whispered. Ayanna helped. She moved slower, but steadier. Her wound was healing, just enough to fight. When the fire got low, Wyatt handed her a can of beans, and they shared it in silence. No prayer, just a nod. That was enough. The dream. He didn't sleep. But sometime near dawn he closed his eyes and saw it. Dust rising on the trail, gunfire in the air, Ayanna screaming his name, and him, bleeding out beside Dusty, hand outstretched. Too late. He woke with his hand clenched tight. The sun was coming. So was hell. The red barn sat at the edge of Widow's Valley like a carcass waiting to be picked clean, paint peeled off the boards like burnt skin. Its roof sagged, bowed under the weight of secrets buried in the dust. Once a place for hay and horses, now it held something darker. You could feel it before you saw it. Wyatt and Ayanna approached, just after high noon, not at sundown like the note demanded. That was the first message. They weren't playing by Silas Thorne's clock. The setup Wyatt rode slow, his rifle tucked beside the saddle, eyes scanning every broken fence post, every crow on a rail. Dusty moved with the calm awareness of a war horse, ears twitching, steps careful. Ayanna rode behind him on a dun mare she'd taken from the cabin's corral. She wasn't healed, but she was steady. They didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because they already understood each other. In silence, they were loud. Inside the barn, the doors groaned open like the ribs of a dying beast. Inside, the air was damp. Rotten hay clung to the floor. Shafts of light bled through cracks in the walls like prison bars. 3 men waited, not soldiers, not lawmen, killers. Mercenaries with dead eyes and twitchy fingers, the kind that got paid by the scream, not the hour. Silas. Thorne wasn't there, but his voice echoed anyway. Hollow, cruel, hidden behind a trapdoor above the loft. I figured you'd be stubborn, Flint, the voice called down. Thought I'd offer you a gentleman's deal. Wyatt stepped forward, rifle down but not loose. You got a funny way of asking, Silas. Sending teeth in a pouch ain't exactly civil. Laughter trickled down like poison. You've got the Apache girl. I've got 30 more like her. This ain't about one woman. This is about what she represents. Ayanna stepped beside. Wyatt, she represents your failure, she said, clear and cold. That shut him up, for a second. The ultimatum. Silas reappeared in the loft, face shadowed by the boards, rifle slung across his chest like a medal. Tell you what, he said. You ride out now. Leave her behind. I'll let you live. Wyatt didn't move. Didn't blink. No. Silas tilted his head. You sure, Cowboy? You ain't young anymore. You bleed like the rest of us. I ain't here to bleed, Wyatt said. I'm here to bury. The moment shattered like glass. Gunfire exploded from the loft. The gunfight, Wyatt. Rolled left, dragging Ayanna behind a stack of rotted crates. Bullets tore through the barn like angry bees. Ayanna grabbed her pistol and fired upward. 3 clean shots. One man screamed. The others kept shooting. Wyatt returned fire with calculated calm. He wasn't fast. He was precise. Like a man who knew the cost of missing. The second man dropped. The third bolted. Ayanna stood, aimed, and fired once. He never made it past the barn doors. The collapsed Silas cursed from above. The loft creaked as he moved. You don't know what you've done, he shouted. You ever been on the wrong end of justice, Silas? Wyatt called back. You think this is justice? Wyatt raised his rifle. I know it is. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder cracking open heaven. Silas crumpled into the loft dust, rifle slipping from his hand. It was done. The pact. They buried the bodies behind the barn. No words, just dirt and silence. Wyatt lit a match and dropped it inside. The red barn lit up like dry kindling. Flames licked the sky, turning the place of torment into ash and smoke. Ayanna stood watching, the fire painting her face in gold and grief. Others. Will come, she said. Wyatt nodded. Let 'em. What now? He looked at her, eyes tired but lit with something rare. Respect. Maybe more. We ride west, he said. Where the law don't choke you and men can't buy souls. She nodded, voice barely a whisper. Then we ride together. The fire behind them was still smoldering when they rode west. 2 shadows against the early dusk, cut from the same cloth of defiance. The prairie opened like a wound, endless, raw, and whispering secrets only the wind remembered. They didn't talk. Much on the trail, didn't need to, sometimes. That's how it is between folks who've bled together, but even silence carries weight when you're headed toward unfinished business. The road to Red Bluff. Red Bluff wasn't on most maps. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into. It was where folks ended up when they had nowhere else to run. Dust settled in the cracks of its bones. The saloon leaned like a drunk against the wind, and the sheriff's office hadn't seen a badge in 5 years. That's where Wyatt led them. Ayanna didn't ask why. Not until they tethered the horses, under the shadow of the broken church steeple. "You sure this is the place?" she asked. Wyatt nodded once, slow. "He's here." "Who?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Finn." Her brow furrowed. "Your friend from the war?" "He was a friend, before he sold his soul." The brother-turned-stranger Finn Cassidy wasn't just another outlaw. He was a legend around these parts. Fast with a gun, faster with lies, and with a silver tongue that had talked more than one man into an early grave. Wyatt and Finn had worn the same uniform once, bled in the same trenches. But war doesn't just break bodies, it twists hearts. Wyatt never forgave Finn for the raid on the Apache camp. That's the scar he carried deepest. "He's working with what's left of Thorne's men," Wyatt said, scanning the faces moving, in and out of the saloon. "Picking off survivors, selling Apache women back into chains." Ayanna's jaw clenched. "I'll slit his throat myself," she said, quiet but deadly. Wyatt shook his head. "No, he's mine." High noon in a broken town, they stepped into the saloon like a thunderstorm rolling over dry land. The room fell to hush. Poker chips stopped clinking. Whiskey glasses paused midair, and at the far end, seated under the mounted skull of a long-dead bull, sat Finn Cassidy. Gray dust clung to his long coat. His hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes, but not the smirk playing on his lips. "Well, I'll be damned," Finn drawled. "Wyatt Flint, riding into my town like some ghost with a badge." "Wyatt didn't. Smile. You left good men to die. You left the war with a halo on your head, Wyatt. But I walked out with something real." Finn lifted a leather pouch. It jingled like teeth. Ayanna's breath hitched. It was the same sound from the trap Thorne set. Wyatt stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his fists were clenched. "You ain't gonna sell another girl, Finn. Who's gonna stop me?" "You?" Wyatt nodded. Then he drew. The draw it was fast. Too fast to think. The saloon exploded in screams and overturned chairs. 2 shots rang out. Only one man hit the floor. Finn's revolver skidded across the planks. His hat lay beside him, pierced clean through. Wyatt stood still, arm extended, smoke trailing from his barrel. Ayanna didn't move. She didn't have to. Justice had already spoken. A quiet goodbye. They didn't stay to drink, didn't wait for the law. Red Bluff was a place, without rules, but even lawless towns understand what vengeance looks like when it's dressed in righteousness. They mounted up and rode slow. The wind shifted east, carrying the last weight off Wyatt's shoulders. Ayanna looked over at him. "You good?" He didn't answer for a long time, but when he did, it was like gravel soaked in mercy. "Not good. Just done." The wind had shifted again. This time it came soft from the south, carrying the scent of mesquite and juniper, not gunpowder and smoke. Wyatt Flint felt it first as he sat under the old cottonwood tree, his hat pulled low, his rifle across his lap more out of habit than fear. Ayanna was nearby, tending the fire. For once, there was no chase behind them, no danger in the hills. Just quiet. But quiet, Wyatt had learned, don't always mean peace. A new path. They hadn't spoken much since Red Bluff. A few words here and there, about supplies, the horses, directions. But the heavy stuff, the real wounds, stayed buried beneath silence. That was the way of folks who'd seen too much. Words couldn't fix everything. But time, maybe. Ayanna finally broke the silence that night. "You ever think about staying put?" Wyatt looked up. "Never had the luxury." "Maybe it ain't about luxury anymore. Maybe it's about roots." He chuckled low, shaking his head. "Roots don't grow in men like me. I've burned too much ground." But Ayana didn't smile. She stared into the fire, eyes reflecting a kind of hope that scared him more than bullets. "Well, maybe," she said. "You just need the right soil." Echoes of the Apache wind in the days that followed, they rode toward Apache land. It wasn't just a place on a map. It was a return. For her. For them. They were greeted not with suspicion, but with watchful eyes and quiet nods. Ayana's people remembered her. Not just the warrior she'd become, but the girl who once danced under moonlight with feathers in her hair and songs in her heart. Wyatt stayed back, always the outsider. But he didn't mind. He watched from a distance as the weight Ayana carried began to lift. She smiled more. She laughed. One night the elders invited Wyatt to sit by the fire. The oldest among them, skin like cracked leather, eyes full of storms, offered him a bowl and spoke through a translator. "You fought with us, not for us. That matters." Wyatt nodded. "I ain't no hero." "No," the elder said. "But you ain't a ghost anymore either." The final letter Wyatt took pen to paper for the first time in years. The letter was for Eliza's mother up in Missouri. She deserved to know the truth. Not the lies he'd let linger. He told her everything. About Finn, the war, the choices that shattered them all. He ended the letter with a line he never thought he'd write. "If forgiveness is too much to ask, then I'll settle for remembrance." He left it at the trading post along with half his savings. Maybe the road could finally end here. A home found weeks passed. Wyatt built a small cabin near the ridge where Ayana liked to hunt. He carved wood, fixed saddles for the local folks, taught a few boys how to hold a rifle proper, not to kill but to defend. Ayana returned from the village one day with a basket full of wild berries and a grin that could melt frost. "They asked me to stay on as a healer." He nodded. "They're smart." She set the basket down, "And they said you can stay too." Wyatt hesitated. Then, "And you? You want me here?" Ayana stepped closer. "I don't need you to stay," she said. "I want you to." A quiet ending, the sun dipped low over the buttes, bleeding gold across the sky. Wyatt sat on the porch, Ayana beside him. Dusty, the old gelding, snorted in the paddock, tail flicking lazily at flies. For the first time in years, Wyatt Flint felt something he hadn't dared name. Belonging. Not because of what he'd done, but in spite of it. He looked over at Ayana. "You reckon this is what peace feels like?" She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Feels like the start of something." The final question: they say the West was won with blood and iron. But some battles don't need guns. Some victories come when the fight inside you finally ends. And, maybe, just maybe, that's what this story was really about. Not vengeance, not redemption, but return. What do you think, stranger? When a man's soul has wandered long enough, can he ever truly find home again?